Section 4 of The Psychology of Peoples by Gustave Le Bon. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Oxenhandler. Chapter 4. The Progressive Differentiation of Individuals and Races. The inequality between the different individuals of a race is greater in proportion to the superiority of the race. Mental equality of all the individuals of inferior races. To appreciate the differences that separate races, the superior individuals of each people, and not its average representatives, must be compared. The progress of civilization tends towards a greater and greater differentiation of individuals and races. Consequences of this differentiation. The psychological reasons which prevent its becoming too considerable. The individuals of the superior races are highly differentiated as regards their intelligence and very slightly so as regards their character. How heredity constantly tends to reduce individual superiorities to the average type of the race. Anatomical observations confirming the progressive psychological differentiation of races, individuals and sexes. The superior races are not distinguished from the inferior races solely by their psychological and anatomical characteristics. A further distinction is supplied by the diversity of the elements of which they are composed. All the individuals of the inferior races, even as regards those of different sex, are on sensibly the same mental level. They all of them resemble one another, and they are thus a perfect exemplification of the equality dreamed of by our modern socialists. In the case of the superior races, on the contrary, the intellectual inequality of the individuals and the sexes is the law. For this reason, in order to appreciate the differences that separate peoples, their superior representatives, when they possess such, and not their inferior, must be compared. Hindus, Chinese and Europeans are but slightly differentiated intellectually so far as their average representatives are concerned. On the other hand, when their superior representatives are compared, their differentiation is found to be considerable. With the progress of civilization, not only races but also the individuals of each race, those at least of the superior races, tend to become more and more differentiated. The result of modern civilization, clashing with our dreams of equality, is not to render men more and more equal intellectually, but on the contrary, more and more different. One of the principal consequences of civilization is, on the one hand, to differentiate races by the daily increasing intellectual exertion it demands of peoples who have attained to a high degree of culture, and on the other to widen the distinctions between the various grades of which each civilized people is composed. The conditions of modern industrial evolution condemn the inferior classes of civilized peoples to a highly specialized labour which, far from increasing their intelligence, merely tends to lessen it. 100 years ago a workman was a veritable artist, capable of executing all the details of any piece of mechanism, of a watch for example. Today he is a mere toiler, who never produces more than one specialty, who spends his life boring the same holes, polishing the same portion of an article, driving the same machine. The result is that the atrophy of his intelligence is soon complete. The manufacturer or the engineer who directs the workman is obliged, on the contrary, owing to the pressure of discoveries and competition, to possess far more numerous acquirements and much more enterprise and invention than his predecessor of a century back. His brain is constantly exercised, and undergoing the law which applies to all organs in such a case, becomes more and more developed. Tocqueville had already pointed out this progressive differentiation of the social grades at a period when industry was far from having attained to the degree of development it has reached today. In proportion as the principle of the division of labour receives more thorough application, the workman becomes weaker, of narrower intelligence and more dependent. Art progresses, the artisan falls back. Every day the difference between the employer and the workman increases. At the present day a superior people may be considered, from the intellectual point of view, to constitute a sort of pyramid of steps, the majority of which are formed by the masses of the population, the upper steps by the intelligent classes. I say intelligent without adding cultured. It is a characteristic error of the Latin peoples to believe that intelligence and culture go together. Culture merely implies the possession of a certain amount of memory, but to acquire it no judgment, reflection, initiative or invention are necessary. Persons of very restricted intelligence are often met with among those who have passed examinations, while it is quite as common to find persons of a very slight degree of culture who are highly intelligent. The upper portion of our pyramid would be formed then by elements taken from all classes. All the professions contain a very small number of notable intelligences. Still, it appears probable, in virtue of the laws of heredity, that what are known as the superior social classes contain the greater number, and it is doubtless herein that their superiority lies. And the point of the pyramid by a very small elite of men of science, inventors, artists and writers, an exceedingly restricted group as compared with the rest of the population, but the only group that determines the rank of a country in the intellectual scale of civilization. It would suffice for it to disappear for all that constitutes the glory of a nation to disappear at the same time. Were France, as Saint Simon has rightly observed, to lose suddenly its 50 leading men of science, its 50 leading artists, its 50 leading manufacturers, its 50 leading agriculturalists, the nation would become a body without a soul. It would be decapitated. If, on the contrary, it were to lose all its officials, the French would grieve at the loss because they are soft-hearted, but the country would sustain very little harm." With the progress of civilization, the differentiation between the extreme grades of a population proceeds with great rapidity. It even tends on occasion to increase in what mathematicians call geometrical progression. It would suffice, in consequence, if certain effects of heredity did not intervene, to allow time to act to see the superior grades of a population separated intellectually from the inferior grades by a distance as great as that which separates the white man from the Negro, or even the Negro from the monkey. For several reasons, however, this intellectual differentiation of the social grades, considerable though it becomes, is not accomplished with the rapidity that might be possible theoretically. In the first place, the differentiation is almost confined to the intelligence, and affects the character to a very slight extent, and we know that it is the character and not the intelligence that plays the fundamental part in the life of peoples. In the second place, the masses are tending at the present day, in virtue of their organisation and discipline, to become all-powerful. Their hatred of intellectual superiority being evident, it is probable that every intellectual aristocracy is destined to be violently destroyed by periodic revolutions in proportion as the masses become organised, and just as the ancient nobility was destroyed a century ago, when socialism shall have become master in Europe, its only chance of enduring will be to exterminate all the individuals, without exception, endowed with a superiority capable of raising them, however slightly, above the most humble level. The two causes I have just set forth are of an artificial order, since they are the result of conditions of civilization that may vary. But there is a further and far more important cause. It is an irresistible natural law, which will always prevent the elite of a nation, not from becoming intellectually differentiated from the inferior grades, but from becoming so differentiated too rapidly. The present conditions of civilization, which tend more and more to differentiate men of the same race, are confronted by the powerful laws of heredity, which tend to bring about the disappearance of the individuals who surpass the average in too marked a manner, or at least to bring them down to this average. Observations already old, recorded by the authors of investigations into heredity, have proved that the descendants of families distinguished by their intelligence are subject sooner or later, and most usually at an early date, to a process of degeneration which tends to extinguish them entirely. Great intellectual superiority seems, then, to carry with it the penalty that those who possess it leave behind them degenerate offspring. In reality, the point of the social pyramid of which I spoke above can only subsist on the condition that it assimilates elements from below. If all the individuals composing this elite were to be relegated to an isolated island, their intermarriages would result in the formation of a race displaying a variety of degenerate symptoms and destined in consequence to disappear speedily. Great intellectual superiorities may be compared to the botanical monstrosities created by the artifice of a gardener. Left to themselves, they die off or return to the average type of the species, for the species is all-powerful since it represents the long series of ancestors. Attentive study of the different peoples shows that while the individuals of a given race may be immensely differentiated as regards the intelligence, they are but slightly differentiated as regards the character. that unalterable rock of which I have already shown the permanence throughout the ages. In studying a race it should be considered in consequence from two very different points of view. From the intellectual point of view, its value depends on a small elite, to which is due the scientific, literary and industrial progress of the civilization. From the point of view of character, acquaintance with the average is alone important. The strength of peoples is always dependent on the level of this average. Peoples may do at a pinch without an intellectual elite, but not without a certain level of character. We shall shortly prove this statement. It is thus seen that while the individuals of a race become more and more differentiated intellectually, as time goes on, they always tend, as far as character is concerned, to oscillate round the average type of the race. It is to this average type, which progresses very slowly, that the great majority of the members of a nation belong. Around this fundamental kernel is found, in the case at least of the superior peoples, a thin layer of eminent minds, whose action is of capital importance as regards civilization, but is without importance as regards the race. Incessantly being destroyed, it is incessantly being renewed at the expense of the average grades, which for their part vary but very slowly, since the slightest variations, in order to become durable, must be accumulated in the same direction by heredity during several centuries. It was several years ago that I arrived, basing my conclusions on researches of a purely anatomical order, at the idea just enunciated touching the differentiation of individuals and races, and to justify which I have now invoked none but psychological reasons. As the two kinds of observation lead to the same results, I may be allowed to recall some of the conclusions of my earlier investigations. They are based on measurements executed on several thousands of skulls, ancient and modern, belonging to different races. I proceed to give the more essential passages. The volume of the skull bears a close relation to the intelligence. When leaving individual cases out of consideration, series are dealt with. It is then found that what distinguishes inferior from superior races is not the slight variations in the average capacity of their skulls, but this essential fact that the superior race contains a certain number of individuals whose brain is highly developed, whereas the inferior race contains no such individuals. Races differ in consequence not in respect to the masses that constitute them, but in respect to the small number of individuals who stand out from the crowd. The average difference between the skull in the case of two peoples, except when quite inferior races are under consideration, is never very considerable. When the skulls are compared of the various human races belonging to the past and present, it is found that the races in which the volume of the skull presents the greatest individual variations are the most highly civilized races. That in proportion as a race grows civilized, the skulls of the individuals composing it become more and more differentiated, a fact which leads to the result that civilization conduces not to intellectual equality, but to an inequality that is always growing more pronounced. Anatomical and physiological equality only exist in the case of individuals of quite inferior races. The differences between the members of a tribe of savages, all of whom follow the same occupation, are perforce of the slightest. Between the peasant whose vocabulary consists of some 300 words and the man of learning who is familiar with 100,000 words and with the ideas that correspond to them, the difference is, on the contrary, enormous. I should add to what precedes that the differentiation of individuals brought about by the development of civilization is also apparent in the case of the sexes. Among inferior peoples or the inferior classes of superior peoples, the man and the woman are intellectually on much the same level. On the other hand, in proportion as peoples grow civilized, the difference between the sexes is accentuated. The volume of the male and female skull, even when the subjects compared, as in my investigations, are strictly of the same age, height and weight, presents differences that increase rapidly with the degree of civilization. Very slight in the case of the inferior races, these differences become immense in the case of the superior races. In these superior races the feminine skulls are often scarcely more developed than those of the women of very inferior races, whereas the average volume of the skulls of male Parisians is such as to range them among the largest known skulls. The average of the skulls of female Parisians classes them among the smallest skulls with which we are acquainted, almost on a level with the skulls of Chinese women, and scarcely above the feminine skulls of New Caledonia. Footnote: Dr. Gustave Le Bon, Recherches anatomiques et mathématiques sur les variations des volumes du cerveau et sur leurs relations avec l'intelligence. 8, volume 1879, memoir crowned by the Academy of Sciences and by the Society of Anthropology. End of footnote. End of section 4.